From death-defying acts that went horribly wrong to aging musicians who never finished their last set, here are some famous folks who literally worked until the end, dying while on stage or on live television. Operas frequently and loudly portray tragedy, but neither the performers nor the audience expected it to cross over into real life, and certainly not in the middle of a performance. But that's what happened to Metropolitan Opera singer Richard Versalle, who broke the fourth wall in the most tragic way possible. In January 1996, Versalle was performing in the Macropolis case, playing the role of Vitek, an old man who works in a law firm. In the opera's opening scene, Versalle stood perched high atop a library-style ladder putting away a case file. Versalle sang the line, "Too bad you can only live so long." Then, inadvertently proving his point, he suddenly fell off the ladder. And the reason for his unscripted fall? The 63-year-old tenor, whose career took him all over Europe and beyond, had suffered a fatal heart attack that caused him to lose balance. In the mid-20th century, Jerome Rodale advocated some health habits that were considered pretty out there at the time, but which are now totally normal, like eating foods that aren't loaded with antibiotics or eating local. Rodale wrote and spoke for years about how those and other healthy practices would extend one's lifespan. While taping the Dick Cavett Show in June 1971, the 72-year-old longevity guru claimed that he never felt better and that he'd lived to 100. Unfortunately, he died a few minutes after making that statement. Rodale stayed on stage while Cavett interviewed another guest, sitting quietly, then letting out some kind of ghastly guttural noise. He'd gone pale, his mouth hung open, and Rodale died right there on the set of Dick Cavett in front of a live studio audience.
He was quite funny. I had made a mental note to have him back.
Chinese-born husband and wife violinists Zhao Gu and Ying Zhao moved to the Houston area and joined the Symphony of Southeast Texas in the mid-1990s. It became their home orchestra, and they were regular members of the string section over the years. So Zhao was right there on April 6, 2019, when during the symphony's final performance of the season at a theater in Beaumont, Texas, her husband suddenly slumped and slid out of his chair to the floor. The musicians immediately stopped playing, and several doctors in the audience rushed to the stage to help. CPR was administered as paramedics made their way to the concert hall. The violinist was rushed to a nearby hospital, but it was too late. Zhao Gu was pronounced dead at the age of 60. Edith Webster was the star of the suburban Baltimore theater scene. At the Towson Moose Lodge in November 1986, she performed a role she'd done more than half a dozen times before, the grandmother-in-law of the titular drunkard in a musical melodrama called The Drunkard. In the long-running play, which dates back to the 19th century, the character Webster played dies at the end of the first act, right after singing a ballad called "Please Don't Talk About Me When I'm Gone." Webster finished the song, clutched at her heart, and her character died as the stage lights blacked out. Unfortunately, so did Webster, who at that moment had a heart attack, crumpled to the floor, and died. It was a poignant moment to perish as the audience loudly clapped in praise of her last performance, having no idea at first what had just happened. The play's director, Richard Bird, told United Press International there was tremendous applause. Hearing that, she died. Wrestling may be scripted, but that doesn't mean it's not dangerous. Injuries happen all the time, with scores of broken bones, concussions, and internal injuries recorded by medical professionals who treated these athletic performers over the years. Deaths happen too, and in 2009, Japanese wrestling lost one of their most popular and prolific wrestlers after a terrible incident that unfolded in front of spectators who'd been expecting to see a tag team match, not a death. The 46-year-old Mitsuharu Misawa was thrown to the mat in a pretty standard wrestling move that went terribly wrong. The move knocked him unconscious, and he suffered a massive heart attack. Reports suggested that his heart stopped immediately, and in spite of efforts to resuscitate him, he was ultimately declared dead after being rushed to the hospital. At the time of his death, Misawa had been wrestling for years. He made his big debut in the mid-1980s, skyrocketed to fame, and was so popular that he took over an existing character called Tiger Mask. Ultimately rebranding as his own entity, he remained a driving force in Japanese wrestling, ensuring it would continue to attract the next generation of fans. In a statement made following his untimely death, then WWE executive John Laurinaitis said, "Misawa will be remembered as one of the all-time greats in Japan." Ian Cognito, the stage persona of Paul Barbieri, was the sort of stand-up comic described as caustic and combative, who made jokes about stalking and killing women, and who frequently ridiculed the disabled. Although he also claimed to be putting on a stage persona far removed from himself, a 2022 documentary told a story of alcohol addiction and mental health concerns. In 2019, he was performing a gig in Bicester when he launched into a bit about dying on stage. He joked about having a stroke and waking up speaking Welsh, and even went as far as to say, "Imagine if I died in front of you lot here." He then sat down on a stool on the stage, appeared to have trouble breathing, and died.
The man who shocked audiences, and he gave them one last shock, didn't he?
Everyone thought it was part of the act, with one audience member saying, "We came out feeling really sick. We just sat there for 5 minutes watching him, laughing at him." The official cause of his death was an aortic dissection, or artery tear, and he sat on stage for a bit until the club owner, Andrew Bird, went up to see if he was actually all right. Bird recalled, "Even when I walked on stage and touched his arm, I was expecting him to say, 'Boo.'"
This is Don Brancheau. Don is the senior trainer here at Shamu Stadium.
It was a headline-making incident that led to a massive public backlash, as well as a documentary detailing all the reasons why killer whales and other similar marine animals shouldn't be kept in captivity, and it happened on February 24, 2010. Visitors to SeaWorld Orlando who were attending a killer whale show saw the gruesome death of veteran trainer Don Brancheau as it played out in real time behind a thick pane of glass. Audiences were getting ready for the killer whale Tilikum to be summoned to the window for photo ops when other staff members realized something was horribly wrong. He had Brancheau in his mouth, and witnesses would later say that they were certain once he had pulled her underwater, he hadn't let her go. One visitor interviewed in the Orange County Sheriff's Office investigation following Brancheau's death testified that he had a trainer in his mouth and was shaking the trainer and moving extremely fast. The results of her autopsy were grisly. The official cause of death was drowning and traumatic injury, which is something of an understatement. The 12,000-pound killer whale had broken numerous bones, and recovery of her body meant SeaWorld employees were sent into the water to recover her scalp and hair. In an awful footnote to that story, it came out that Tilikum had previously been linked to the deaths of two others, killed in 1991 and 1999. Tilikum died in 2017 after 33 years of captivity. The initial news reports about the death of Brazilian gospel singer Pedro Henrique were understandably vague. No one, after all, expected the 30-year-old singer to die in mid-performance. Early reports suggested that he reported feeling sick before taking the stage in a 2023 concert. The tragic death took place not only in front of the live audience, but those watching via live stream. It was later confirmed that he'd suffered a heart attack. In a bizarre footnote, his death added fuel to COVID conspiracy theories about dangerous vaccines, in spite of the fact that his vaccination status wasn't even confirmed when he died. In 2022, Philadelphia bid farewell to one of the most beloved figures on the city's LGBTQ+ scene, the drag artist known as Valencia Prime. The loss was deeply felt, with an outpouring of tributes such as the Facebook message posted by fellow drag performer Aloe Vera, which read, "You are and will forever be my light. I wish I knew how to keep going without you. A piece of my soul has been taken from me, and I'm struggling to pick myself up off the ground without you."
She really was everywhere in the scene. If you didn't know who Valencia Prime was, then you haven't seen Philadelphia drag.
The 25-year-old Prime had been hosting her showcase event, Primetime, at the Taboo nightclub when she collapsed on stage. By the time first responders arrived on the scene, she was unresponsive. Her cause of death was later revealed as atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease, a condition that involves a narrowing of the arteries. The devastation felt by the community was clear.
Just knowing that she's up there and she's looking down on us, we're going to keep on performing because I know that's what she would want us to do.
The Great Wallendas were among the most famous circus acts in the world. The German-born Karl Wallenda and his brother Hermann made a living performing their high-wire act for crowds in the early 20th century, and they gradually grew their act to include many family members, all of whom seemed to inherit an almost supernatural sense of balance. Their act wasn't without tragedy, though, and in 1962, two members of the group were killed during a performance, while another was paralyzed.
They never thought that it would ever happen. And public were finally aware of how dangerous circus work is.
The group was in the middle of a high-wire pyramid act they'd been doing for years, when first-time performer Dieter Schepp fell, along with fellow performer Richard Fawn. Another survived a fall, while several others, including Karl, stayed on the wire. Despite the tragedy, they continued to perform, and in 1972, Karl's son-in-law Richard Guzman was killed during a performance when he touched an electric wire. Troupe patriarch Karl also died in mid-act. He was staging a 1978 promotional performance for the Pan American Circus in San Juan, and although he had been warned of the high winds he would face while walking the wire, he opted to go through with the performance anyway. He lost his balance while crossing and died after falling 100 feet to the street below. His wife wasn't watching. She'd refused to watch a performance since the 1962 tragedy. She told an interviewer, "I never watch performances anymore. I always sit in the back room and pray." There was a time in the not-so-distant past when Wild West shows were all the rage, and one of the shows touring in the 1880s was Frank Prain's. Prain was an expert marksman who found his niche in the genre by staging shows that were essentially theater productions, with some daring trick shooting incorporated into the story. It was during one of these performances that an actor named Annie von Behren was shot and killed. Von Behren wasn't just another show employee, she was also Prain's fiancée. In November 1882, the whole show headed to Cincinnati, where they installed themselves in one of the city's finest theaters. Frayn's act filled the 2,000-seat Coliseum for days, and a crowd favorite was a piece called Cy Slocum. In one part, the dastardly villain of the story persuades Frayn's character to shoot an apple off his wife's head. However, after countless successful performances, it suddenly went terribly wrong and Frayn shots his real-life fiancée. The curtain dropped and the audience was assured that they definitely hadn't seen what they'd actually just seen. Frayn was charged with manslaughter, but it was ultimately determined that the gun had malfunctioned in what was simply a deadly accident. The judge agreed with the prosecution, who declared, Frayn had already suffered the worst that could happen to anyone, and that no punishment which the law might inflict could give greater weight to the lesson of this accident. By the time Lillian Hardin married fellow musician Louis Armstrong, she already had an impressive career of her own. She was one of the most popular jazz musicians of her era, a classically trained, ridiculously gifted talent who played the piano with King Oliver's Creole Band. Lillian and Louis married in 1924 and were divorced by 1938, but his life would have a decades-long impact on hers, culminating with her death in 1971. Louis died on July 6, 1971, and on August 27th of the same year, a group of entertainers took to stage at Chicago's Civic Center Plaza in a musical tribute to him. That included Lillian, who was playing when she collapsed on stage. Bystanders attempted life-saving measures and first responders were called, but it was later reported that she had suffered a heart attack mid-performance before passing away. So here's a super strange story, one that might be enough to make even the biggest cynic think twice about whether or not to believe a place can be cursed. The place in question is Munich's National Theater, a 2,100-seat theater that originally opened in 1818 and was rebuilt twice, once after being destroyed by a fire and again after World War II. It's also the place where 4 conductors died during or immediately after performances. Conductor Joseph Keilberth collapsed and died in front of an audience in 1968 while conducting Tristan and Isolde. It would later be reported that he'd suffer a massive heart attack while standing at the podium. And here's the weird thing. 57 years before, another conductor, Felix Motel, died 11 days after also suffering a heart attack in front of an audience while conducting the same piece. Other conductors have suffered medical emergencies mid-performance as well. British actor Gordon Reid might not be a household name, but fans of British television will likely know him, as will fans of British theater. He popped up in shows like Doctor Who, The Legend of Robin Hood, All Creatures Great and Small, and more recently as one of the main characters in Dr. Finlay.
Good evening. Angus Livingston.
He was a mainstay of the BBC's radio drama company, and when he died on stage at London's Finborough Theatre, his obituary in the Herald read, "Tragic though his death has been, his colleagues all knew that he would not have wanted to die in any other way." His death came during a 2003 performance of Waiting for Godot, and in a sort of fitting twist, his last reported words were, "There's nothing to do." In 1952, Joseph Cram won the Pulitzer Prize in Drama for his play The Shrike, and it's safe to say that that's the sort of thing that becomes one of the high points in anyone's life. 3 years later, though, that play would be tainted by tragedy when Cram's wife, Isabel Bonner, died on stage during a performance. According to reports, the audience didn't entirely know what was going on when it happened, and neither did her co-star, Dane Clark. Bonner was in the middle of a scene where she was in a hospital, and Clark ad-libbed a bit of dialogue when she collapsed, thinking it was part of her performance. Wasn't. The curtain was dropped, blocking the view of the 700-odd audience members in attendance. An autopsy later revealed that she had suffered a cerebral hemorrhage, and when she died, many audience members were absolutely unaware of what they had just witnessed. Japanese dance theater companies can create some of the most stunningly beautiful movements that the human form is capable of. And when the Sakai-juku troupe headed to America in 1984, they drew massive crowds. One of their flagship performances included dancers hanging from ropes in an aerial ballet meant to symbolize a life leading to the inevitable end. And in 1985, Seattle audiences gathered in Pioneer Square witnessed a very real death. 4 dancers began their descent from 4 ropes. Just minutes into the performance, one of the ropes snapped. Dancer Yoshiyuki Takada fell about 80 feet and suffered catastrophic injuries. In spite of the fact there was a doctor not far from where he landed, his injuries were fatal. Witnesses who were later interviewed said they'd expected a safety harness to stop his fall, and initially it seemed to be part of the performance. Another thought the falling figure was a mannequin, a belief helped in part by the fact that when he fell in eerie silence. David Olney was one of folk music's best singer-songwriters, and although he was arguably more successful as a composer, there's no doubt that the genre wouldn't be the same without his work, which included songs like Women Cross the River, Deeper Well, Big Cadillac, and Queen Anne's Lace. His skills were widely lauded, and when he died in 2020 in front of the audience at the 30A Songwriters Festival, it was a shocking yet strangely peaceful end to a decades-long career.
He had a charisma that I would liken with Johnny Cash and Chris Christopherson. It was like, oh, Olney's here.
Olney was in the middle of performing with Amy Rigby, who posted on Facebook about what happened in the hours and moments leading up to his death. She said they'd been laughing and joking, commenting on the wintertime Florida rain, and then Olney was in the middle of his third song when he stopped, apologized, and shut his eyes. He was very still, sitting upright with his guitar on. I just want the picture to be as graceful and dignified as it was, because it at first looked like he was just taking a moment. Once those in attendance realized what had happened, they summoned paramedics and attempted to revive him, to no avail. The 71-year-old Olney, who had previously had heart surgery, was dead of a heart attack. His last words were, "I'm sorry."